Story 1: The Night Watcher's Secret. Jake Thompson had been a security guard at Willowbrook Mall for almost a decade. The mall, once a bustling hub of activity, had fallen into disrepair over the years, with many shops closing down. Now, Jake spent most of his nights patrolling empty hallways and darkened storefronts. It was a lonely job, but it paid the bills, and Jake had grown used to the eerie silence that enveloped the mall after dark. One night, while on his usual rounds, Jake noticed something strange. The mannequins in one of the abandoned clothing stores had been moved. He was certain that when he had passed by earlier, they had been facing the front of the store, their lifeless eyes staring out into the corridor. Now, they were turned toward each other, as if engaged in some silent conversation. A chill ran down Jake's spine, but he brushed it off as a prank. Maybe some kids had sneaked in and moved them around, though he hadn't seen any signs of forced entry. As the night wore on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every creak and groan of the old building made him jumpy. His flashlight's beam seemed to only highlight the darkness that swallowed up the once bright mall. He found himself frequently looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. Around 3 a.m., Jake heard a noise that made his blood run cold. It was a soft, shuffling sound like footsteps, but slower and more deliberate. He quickly turned off his flashlight and crouched behind a nearby kiosk, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound grew closer, echoing through the empty halls. He strained his ears, trying to pinpoint the direction it was coming from. It was then that he saw a shadowy figure moving slowly through the mall, just barely visible in the dim light. Jake's first thought was that it was another security guard, but he knew that wasn't possible. He was the only one on duty that night. The figure moved in an unnatural way, its limbs stiff and jerky, as if it were struggling to control its movements. Jake watched in horror as it approached the clothing store where the mannequins had been moved. The figure paused in front of the store, and for a moment, Jake thought it was going to enter. But then it did something even more disturbing. It turned its head slowly, unnaturally, as if it were a puppet on strings, and looked directly at him. Jake froze. The figure's face was hidden in the shadows, but he could feel its eyes boring into him, cold and malevolent. He could sense a deep, dark intent behind that gaze, something ancient and evil. The figure raised one hand and beckoned him, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent a wave of terror crashing over him. Jake wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the figure turned and glided away, disappearing into the darkness of the mall. Jake remained frozen for what felt like an eternity before he finally mustered the courage to stand up. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the mall and never return, but his sense of duty compelled him to finish his rounds. He forced himself to continue, though his hands trembled and his heart raced. As he passed the clothing store again, he noticed that the mannequins had been moved once more. This time they were arranged in a circle, all facing inward. It was as if they were involved in some kind of ritual, their plastic faces twisted into grotesque expressions of horror. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he realized that one of the mannequins was missing. Before he could react, he heard the shuffling sound again, closer this time. He turned around slowly, dreading what he might see. The figure was back, standing just a few feet away, its face now partially visible in the dim light. It was not human. Its features were distorted, its eyes hollow and empty, its skin a sickly, grayish hue. It extended a bony hand toward him, and Jake felt a wave of cold wash over him, sapping his strength and will. In a blind panic, Jake bolted, running through the mall as fast as his legs could carry him. He didn't stop until he reached the security office, slamming the door shut behind him. He fumbled for the phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. When he finally reached his supervisor, he could barely get the words out. There's something in the mall. Something, not human. His supervisor was skeptical, but he agreed to send someone to relieve Jake. When the morning shift arrived, they found him huddled in the corner of the office, pale and shaking, his eyes wide with terror. Jake never returned to the Willowbrook Mall. He quit his job the next day, unwilling to face whatever evil lurked in the shadows. The mall was eventually torn down, but Jake knew that whatever had haunted him that night was not bound to that place. It was out there, somewhere, waiting for its next victim. Story 2: The Haunted Hospital Wing. Mark Stevens had always prided himself on being level-headed. As a security guard at the old St. Augustine Hospital, He had seen his share of strange things, but nothing had ever rattled him until the night he was assigned to patrol the abandoned wing. St. Augustine was a sprawling complex, with most of the buildings still in use, but the east wing had been closed off for years. It was said that the wing was haunted, though Mark didn't believe in such things. Still, when his supervisor told him that they had received reports of strange noises coming from the area, he felt a twinge of unease. The east wing was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. It was dark and dilapidated, with peeling paint and broken windows. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from Mark's flashlight, casting long, ominous shadows on the walls. As he walked through the deserted hallways, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. The first sign that something was wrong came when he reached the old operating theater. The door, which had been sealed shut for years, was slightly ajar. Mark hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open, his flashlight revealing the room beyond. It was exactly as he had expected: dusty, with outdated equipment and rows of rusty surgical tools. But there was something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. In the center of the room, standing on the old operating table, was a single, blood-stained surgical gown. It was as if someone had placed it there deliberately, as a macabre ring. Mark's heart raced as he approached it, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The gown looked fresh, as if the blood had been spilled only moments ago, but there was no one else in the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. Mark spun around, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped, alone in a room where something terrible had happened. He could feel the presence of something evil, something that wanted him to suffer. As he backed away from the door, he heard a low, guttural whisper. It was coming from the darkness, from somewhere just beyond the reach of his flashlight. The voice was unintelligible, but the malice behind it was unmistakable. Mark's breath quickened as he swept the room with his light, searching for the source of the sound. Then he saw a figure standing in the far corner of the room, its features obscured by shadow. It was dressed in a tattered, blood-soaked gown, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The figure took a step forward, and Mark's blood ran cold. He could see its face now, twisted and deformed, its eyes burning with a hatred that seemed to reach out and claw at his very soul. Mark stumbled backward, his mind racing. He had to get out of there, but the door was locked, and the figure was closing in on him. In a desperate bid to escape, he grabbed one of the old surgical tools, a rusty scalpel, and brandished it at the figure. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice trembling. But the figure didn't stop. It kept advancing, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. Mark could feel his sanity slipping away as the figure loomed closer, its breath hot and rancid against his skin. Just when he thought it was all over, the door behind him burst open, flooding the room with light. Mark turned to see his supervisor standing in the doorway, his face pale with shock. The figure was gone, leaving only the bloody gown and the lingering scent of decay. Mark was pulled from the room, his mind reeling. He could barely process what had just happened, but one thing was clear: he would never set foot in the East Wing again. The hospital tried to cover up the incident, but rumors spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the wing was permanently sealed off. Mark left his job soon after, unable to shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, waiting for its next victim. He knew that the hospital held dark secrets, and he had come too close to becoming one of them. Now, every time he closes his eyes, he sees that twisted face, hears that guttural whisper,